Hello again everybody, and continuing with my theme of looking at the Roman Empire through the prism of letters, we're continuing with some more another letter of Pliny today, and a reply from no less than the Emperor Trajan. So it's an interesting subject really. Pliny's an interesting character, an interesting author of letters. He wrote many, and he obviously revised these for publication. Some of these are sort of business-like letters, some of them are letters to his friends. There's an interesting one coming up about Vesuvius, and there's a whole collection of them, a whole section which are correspondence with the Emperor Trajan. There's also some very tender and personal letters to his wife Calpurnia, and it's not all that common for tenderness to be shown between men and their wives, or between wives and their husbands. So that's quite an interesting insight. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about a letter from Pliny to the Emperor Trajan from the province of Bithynia, which is part of what is now Turkey, northern Turkey. And it was this was about a place called Nicomedia. And it was, it's not so famous now, but for a time it was very famous. In the late 3rd, early 4th century, it was actually the capital of the eastern part of the empire, from Diocletian up to the Emperor Constantine, and Constantine then moved it to a new city, or redeveloped Byzantium, which he called Constantinople. But Nicomedia was briefly famous for a terrible persecution in 303 AD, and one of the people who seems to have died as part of that persecution was the man who was later known as Saint George, the patron saint of England, who was actually Turkish originally. A bit of a blow for some white nationalists in Britain, I guess, but there we are. Anyway, Pliny writes to the Emperor Trajan about things he doesn't want the blame for. Maybe he can't make decisions, maybe he's a bit indecisive. You can tell from some of Trajan's replies that Trajan was a bit impatient, in the sense of, oh, for goodness sake, I sent you out there to do a job, just get on and do the job, and don't keep bothering me with all your petty questions. However, it might tell us something about the nature of emperors before Trajan, that they were so impatient and indeed brutal. Emperors such as Domitian, under whom Pliny had, well, his career had prospered, and Domitian was famously unforgiving to people that he didn't like. So maybe it was just a kind of covering your back. Trajan, incidentally, is regarded as one of the best emperors of Rome, and indeed by the historian Edward Gibbon as the best of them all, and he said the Roman Empire was at its happiest under the Emperor Trajan. But the letters from Pliny to Trajan tell us quite a lot about what governors actually did, the problems they dealt with, and how they and how those problems actually occurred and were resolved. I'm going to talk about a religious problem which occurred in a future talk, perhaps the next one, but it's financial mismanagement today. Now, every city, modern cities and ancient cities, relies on its water supply, and Nicomedia, an expanding and flourishing local capital, needed more water, and so Rome's famous aqueducts needed to come into play, and so more aqueducts needed to be built. How did they get built? And were they all as amazing as it sometimes seems, like the one in Tarragona or the Pont du Gard in France, or indeed the aqueducts leading to the Aqua Virgo in Rome? It's also interesting to think that the water supply was clearly a state responsibility, not privatised water companies like happens often these days, but they were obviously privately constructed. Sounds very like PFI projects in Britain. Things don't always work out, things are not always marvellous. There's delays and failures and cost overruns. So let's see what Pliny has to say about all this. So, Pliny to the Emperor Trajan. The citizens of Nicomedia, sir, have spent 3,318,000 sesterces on an aqueduct which they abandoned before it was finished and finally demolished. Then they made a grant of 200,000 sesterces towards another one, but this too was abandoned. so that even after squandering such enormous sums, they must still spend more money if they're to have an adequate water supply. I have been myself to look at the spring which could supply pure water to be brought along an aqueduct as originally intended, if the supply is not to be confined to the lower lying parts of the town. There are very few arches still standing, but others could be built out of the blocks of stone taken from the earlier construction, and I think some ought to be made out of brick, which would be easier and cheaper. The first essential is for you, sir, to send out an engineer or an architect to prevent a third failure. I will add only that the finished work will combine utility with beauty and will be well worthy of your reign. Well, a bit of flattery at the end there to make sure he gets his way. So what should happen? Should Trajan fork out some more money? Should he send out an engineer? Should he just tell Pliny to get on with it? Well, we have Trajan's reply. This is how Trajan replied. Steps must be taken to provide Nicomedia with a water supply, and I'm sure you'll apply yourself to the task in the right way. But for goodness sake, apply yourself no less to finding out whose fault it is that Nicomedia has wasted so much money up to date. It may be that people have profited by this starting and abandoning of aqueducts. Let me know the result of your inquiry. Well, that might have some messages for today. Trajan clearly just, part of the answer is, Pliny, sort it out. It's interesting, there was a news report fairly recently, within the last week, that the HS2 rail project, it was said, has been brought into contact with reality. Who knows what they were planning before they met reality, but who knows whether it'll ever get finished. It sounds remarkably like abandoned aqueducts in Nicomedia to me. Anyway, the aqueducts in Nicomedia apparently did get built, and the city did develop and became the capital of the Eastern Empire for a while. So maybe Trajan's firm reply has a message for us. For goodness sake, find out who was responsible and make sure they don't get away with it again.